Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Intersectionality, Engaging Greater Conversations. I'm here with our panel tonight. I'm going to be monitoring the panel discussion / community conversation, but I'm really going to be pretty much turning everything over to the panel tonight. Just wanted to remind you of a couple things. If you have any questions or comments during the course of this evening's presentation, just type them into the comments box, either on Facebook or YouTube, and they will pop up for me. And when we get to that portion of the evening, I will get as many questions and comments to our panel so that they can discuss them as well. And just there, we don't have many ground rules for this, and I know the panel themselves will be getting into this, but just two things to bear in mind. Be respectful. You don't not everyone comes at everything from the exact same vantage point. So of course everyone's going to see something a little bit different, but that doesn't mean that you have to be disrespectful about it. So please be respectful, and it's always nice to be civil. I think those are just two baseline things that we're looking at. So be respectful and civil. But that's enough of me being on a little bit of a soapbox. Just keep that in mind. And so before we get going tonight, I'm going to take myself out of the picture, but I would like everyone on the panel to introduce themselves. And why don't we get started with Luann?
All right, thanks, Tim. My name is Luann Lonergan, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am a board member of Lakeshore's United Visionaries.
Who's next?
Megan.
All right.
My name is Megan Marchant. My pronouns are they, them. I am also a board member of Lakeshore's United Visionaries, as well as PFLAG of Manitowoc County. And I believe next is Natasha.
Hi, my name is Natasha Khan. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am also a board member of Lakeshore's United Visionaries. And next would be Patrick.
Well, there we go. Well, Patrick refuses to be brought over.
Oh, no worries.
There you are.
Yeah, so, good evening. My name is Patrick Neunfeld. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a board member of Lakeshore's United Visionaries, also actively involved in PFLAG Manitowoc County as well, and then serve on a few other boards throughout the Manitowoc community, and have worked in education, higher education, for a little over 15 years.
And last but certainly not least.
Hi, I'm Sonia Vasquez, and my pronouns are she, her. I am also a board member of Lakeshore's United Visionaries, and happy to be here. Thank you, Tim.
Oh, you're welcome. And let me just bring up your PowerPoint, and we can get started. That will take me just 1 second, and we will be good to go. And there we go.
All right, we'll go to the next PowerPoint, Tim, and maybe the next one. All right, before we begin, welcome everyone. The goal of this community conversation is to increase awareness of intersectionality, and we recognize that everyone is at different levels of awareness, and that is all right. This is an opportunity to enter into a discussion and dialogue, recognizing that as humans, we all have intersecting identities. This is a safe space, no judgment. We honor the fact that each of us in attendance brings to the table specific lived experiences, cultural perspectives, and points of view. Our goal is to create a supportive learning environment where ideas, comments, and questions can be addressed and discussed with respect. Our intention is to educate ourselves and one another without judgment.
So when we are going through today, we are going to want to speak from the I, because we want to speak from our own experiences. And not judge or moralize the thoughts of and experiences of others. So we want to use I statements such as I feel or in my experiences, and avoid statements such as you should. We also want to respect others, as Tim said. You might hear ideas today that are different or new, and perspectives that might counter your own. So as we interact and participate in this discussion, please take in new information without judgment and keep an open mind. And be aware of your words because they reflect and make sure they reflect a respectful attitude towards others. And we learn by listening to others. So try to keep that in mind and be supportive of the place that each person comes from.
So don't assume. Please treat everyone here as an individual and do not make assumptions about an individual's gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, class, ability, religion, etc. Then be open to new ideas. Be open to considering new information and incorporating new ideas. It's common to, when encountering new information, that's also could be uncomfortable. It's common to discount it, but make sure that you embrace that uncomfortableness and seek discomfort and be open to receiving new information.
All right, and then be present. So while we recognize the sheer agony of not checking your Facebook, sending Snapchats, or otherwise browsing the internet while you're maybe attending or participating, right? Being present, I think, is, we say that with a little bit of jest and kind of cheekiness, right? But being present, I think, is truly valuable when engaging in a discussion and dialogue that is meaningful or that you hope to be meaningful. And then the next ground rule is really to ask questions. This is an invitation, right? So please feel free to ask questions without fear that you feel like that they maybe are silly or stupid, right? That's not the case. There's no such thing. Be sure to phrase all questions though in respective and like value neutral ways, right? So like this opportunity, I think, is designed to really provide an opportunity to have a safe space for questions, discussion, engagement, and conversation. We learn from asking questions, right? That come from a place of respect. And then we also then learn by listening to others and kind of having that perspective of others' experiences. We promise that any question that comes from a good place, from a well-intended place, will not offend us. We do make that promise, right? This is not a challenge. Rather, again, it's an invitation to have a meaningful conversation, discussion, and dialogue.
All right. So now we're getting into what is intersectionality. So we have two definitions here. One is by Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term and sort of also brought it to sort of fruition. And this, I believe, was like in the 70s. Crenshaw is still talking about intersectionality today, as long as doing a bunch of other great work. So we have her definition, and then we also have the dictionary definition. And to paraphrase her definition, it's basically a lens, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exasperate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts. So to maybe clarify a little bit, it's basically saying, we have maybe one identity, and then we have another identity, such as one is sexuality and then one is race, and when those two things come together, that can impact different ways of moving throughout the world, and how you might have results when interacting with other people or other situations. And then the dictionary definition is the complex cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups, Kimberly Crenshaw introduced the theory of intersectionality. The idea is that when it comes to thinking about how inequities persist, categories like gender, race, and class are best understood as overlapping and mutually constructive rather than isolated and distinct. And so the next slide that we have here is a little video. So this video is from Kimberly Crenshaw talking about intersectionality and sort of explaining it herself. And we feel like this is a better worded, kind of not so academically worded example of explaining intersectionality.
There's no sound, Tim.
Is there still no sound?
There's no sound, Tim.
Because I'm hearing sound on my end, but it might not be going out over the live stream. Is there still no sound?
No sound.
There's no sound.
If we're unable to get it to work, I can kind of briefly explain sort of what Kimberly talks about, probably not as eloquently, but I can give it a try.
Should I keep the video running while you're explaining?
Sure. It might be longer than my little spiel about it, but basically one of the reasons why we liked this example is because Kimberly is talking about a specific way in which intersectionality can have meaning. So an example that's used a lot when talking about intersectionality, such as one that she uses here, is when there was a court case about a woman suing the place that she was working for discrimination. So in this lawsuit, she had argued basically that they were discriminating against her because she was Black and also because she's a woman. And so in the legal system and in like our general society, sometimes we see those things as two separate things. So that's how the legal system was seeing it. They were seeing her Blackness as one thing and her being a woman as another thing. And they also use the argument that, okay, well, her workplace hires women, and her workplace also hires Black people. The issue was that the workplace was hiring Black men and white women or women of other races. So there wasn't anybody besides her that was a woman and Black. And that caused some sort of, discrimination that was happening in the workplace because of being a woman and being Black. If you think about like how sometimes we perceive each other or other people can be perceived, we think about, how is it as a woman walking down the street and seeing a man coming towards you versus a woman seeing another woman coming towards you. We have different thoughts about those things, and maybe that's a more like a safety sort of thing, and maybe a bit more logical than some of the like racist ideas that were sometimes that are in our society. But that's just kind of an example of how our perception of people and specific identities can mean something to that person or to other people. But when we have two different identities that can have specific meanings when they come together, that can affect, for example, like what we were talking about, the woman in the workplace, that affected her experience and her experience from other people. And hence why she was trying to explain within her lawsuit that it's not just about her being a woman. It's not just about her being Black. It's about her being both a woman and Black.
My apologies for the sound not coming through. When I listened, I could hear it perfectly on my end, but that really doesn't help anyone else who's following along, including
That's
you.
okay.
So my
Yeah.
apologies. Did you want to bring up also the story that she tells at the end of this about the person, about preconceived notions, about the person who's bringing their son to the hospital because they need a surgery? Did you want to talk about that at all? I can probably bring that up on the video. Do you know what I'm talking about?
To be honest, I do not remember that part as
Yeah.
clearly.
No,
But if somebody else does, they're totally welcome to join in and explain that part. I will also just say that we are more than happy to share this video and share the PowerPoint if anybody wants to watch it later.
Definitely.
Yeah, so speaking of kind of the story that that Kimberly kind of illustrates at the end of the video, it kind of looks at intersectionality maybe in a little bit different way of how we are maybe not engaging in intersectionality. So the story is that there's a car accident and a child is injured, and the child goes to the hospital. One parent, the father brings his child to the hospital, and then the the surgeon then identifies, I can't operate on this child because this is my child, and that's kind of a very traumatic experience. The implication there is that, well, how can this individual who's bringing the child to the hospital and the surgeon both have the same son, right? So I think kind of listening to that, either A, like it's a couple of same sex, right, or the surgeon is also a woman, right? And how the majority of the time, right, our purview or our thought process is that women are not surgeons, right? Surgeons are not women. And granted, that is not the thought process of every individual, right? However, it's just sort of what is in our societal norm, perhaps, or kind of like based off of our assumptions or our biases, and kind of how those things intersect with one another, and then kind of formulate our views of the world, right? From a negative perspective, right? And there's also examples then too of how our intersectional identities or our intersectional experiences form positive views of the world. So I think that's really kind of the end of the video or the story in a nutshell, and just kind of an example of how intersectionality then interacts, or elements of intersectionality rather interact with one another to form and develop perspective.
Thank you to both of you for filling in the blanks for this non-sound video that I was
bobbing and weaving, Tim, right? That's all good.
All right.
Yeah, so I have the next slide then. So as Sonia really kind of identified, the concept of intersectionality was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw, right? And Kimberly Crenshaw actually introduced the concept of intersectionality in an article in 1989. So really understanding that it refers to the overlapping of intersecting social identities, and then also related systems, of whether those systems are of dominance, oppression, or discrimination, right? It is simply the idea that multiple identities intersect to create a whole, right? So individual identities intersect to create a whole human, if you will, right? So these identities can intersect in ways that include gender, race, social class, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, religion, age, ability, whether that be physical or mental, right? Or health or unhealth, right? So if you're a healthy individual or if you're an unhealthy individual, right? So intersectionality then is also sort of essentially our understanding of these elements of gender and sexuality. To kind of then how it impacts like maybe like social categories, for example, too. When we're looking at the diagram that's on the screen now, we see a line that goes across the screen, and that says dominance, essentially, right? So, like, kind of looking at where is that line of dominance, and what identities are above the line, and like what identities are then below the line, for example. So this is just kind of illustrating a dynamic of power, right? So let's take age, for example. Oftentimes within our societal structures, younger people are maybe given preference versus older people, for example, right? Or young is viewed as more positive or more favorable than advanced age, right? We also can look at maybe religion, for example. Someone who identifies as a Christian-based religion may have, there may be a perception of them being, more of the majority versus the minority, right? Someone who is an individual of color, for example, may be viewed in a more negative way than someone who is not a person of color, for example, right? So what this diagram again is doing is it's simply drawing that line and identifying then in most social situations, in most social structures, who has dominance and who is maybe not experiencing dominance, right? So on the next slide, don't go there just quite yet, Tim, but on the next slide is where we're going to kind of all maybe just kind of unpack like our individual identities and just kind of speak to our lived experiences, right? So I'll kind of start us off, but I want to kind of maybe have this visual as we're having that conversation. So when I look at my identities, for example, or when I look at the elements that make up me as a whole human, I identify as a cisgender white male who is a member of the LGBTQ community, right? I'm a gay man. I'm non-Christian, and I have a master's degree and I'm working on a doctorate, right? So I think when we look at those elements individually, there's a lot of power and or privilege that comes from those identities, right? I can walk into most spaces and feel relatively safe and secure, and feel as if I can engage meaningfully in a conversation and not have any sort of like negative impact, if you will, right? My identity as an LGBTQ member, as a member of the LGBTQ community, that's more invisible, right? If I share that information or if that information is known about me, then sometimes, and I have lived experiences where that has been a very negative thing, right? And but it's something that I can share if I so choose, right? Or if I change my behavior, my mannerisms to pass, if you will, or to quote unquote not act gay, then that is a safer environment for me, right? But if I was truly being more of my authentic self, then I'm going to just simply be who I am, right, unapologetically, and sometimes that can create an unsafe situation because if someone perceives me as being too gay, for example, then there may be confrontation, right? Because that's a lifestyle that they don't agree with. Let's be clear, talking about it as a lifestyle is not okay, right? But that would be sort of like the perspective of it being a lifestyle, right? Being a doctor or a lawyer or a millionaire, like that's a lifestyle. Like being a queer person or being a member of the LGBTQ community, that's simply someone's identity, and who someone is. So the reason that I wanted this image sort of up as we're kind of talking about elements of identity, you're able to then have that, again, have that visual of where someone might be experiencing a non-target, if we will, and where someone might be experiencing a target. I think it's also really important to kind of identify that that line of dominance can shift and change depending on space and time and environment, right? So if I go into a very queer space, right, like I have a lot of privilege in that queer space. The intersectionality of my identities is giving me a very positive experience within queer spaces, for example, right? Because I'm a cisgender white male, and that is sort of the top of the hierarchy, if you will, right? Because there are social hierarchies that exist in every community, right? In terms of what is seen as desirable or more favorable, for example. So again, I offer that context to kind of unpacking the terms and definitions surrounding intersectionality.
Do we need to peek at the next slide to see who's?
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
comes
let's.
after you?
Yeah, Tim, why don't you go ahead and pop over to the next slide?
All right, I will do that.
Sorry, that'll kind of give our order, if you will, that we're kind of unpacking ourselves.
And you can pop back because
Can
I
do.
agree. I agree with Patrick. I think that having this as a visual as we speak is valuable.
I agree as well.
Yeah.
For what that's worth.
Yeah. So like I said before, I'm Megan, and my pronouns are they, them, which puts me in the category of gender nonconforming. So I am not cisgender, nor am I heterosexual. So I'm also a member of the LGBTQ community. I am gay and non-binary. So those are some things that that are below the dominant line for me, and things that are above the dominant line for me would be that I'm white, and that I'm middle class. So those things are advantages when I walk through the world, through the general public, and being gender variant and being gay are things that are out group. So when sometimes we talk about in group, out group, and that changes and shifts depending on what situation that we're in. So like Patrick said, a queer person might be out group in the general public, but when we go into queer spaces, that becomes the in group, or the majority of the identification. So I as a gender variant person, have had some experiences with people not quite knowing what to do with me, because that's not something that I can hide, or that I choose to hide. But I have mostly had positive experiences. And I definitely feel when the shift in these dynamics when going out in the general public versus going into spaces where my identities are majority identities.
All right, and then thank you. Yeah, so for me, sort of two of the sort of identities that I hold that I think are maybe a good example for sort of describing this is being queer and being half Mexican. And so those two things put me in a different spot. For example, as to Megan or Patrick, because of race, but also, being having a queer identity. I'm sort of on that same level with them and having a queer identity, but in being a different race, that sometimes affects things differently. So if somebody, for example, knows, I'm not exactly the most queer presenting, so it's not completely obvious. So passing, like Patrick was saying, and Megan was briefly talking about as well, is a whole other subject. Um, but passing, essentially, for those who may not know, is where you can kind of move about throughout the world without people realizing, what you are. And sometimes that's a benefit and sometimes that's a hindrance. For, queer people, um, it depends on what they prefer or what they'd like to do. I dress and look and act myself pretty much everywhere. I look like this most of the time. So I would consider myself passing. But in the case that somebody knows that I'm queer and that I'm Mexican, they might have these different perceived ideas about me as a person, because my race is different, but because I'm also queer. And so when those two things come together, what does that mean in general societal uh, movement throughout the world? Or what does that mean, for example, like what Patrick was saying, talking about in the queer community? So like he was saying about the hierarchies in the queer community, which, unfortunately, you would think would be sometimes better, or more accepting, is still has those hierarchies, likely because of how we're all brought up in the society that we're brought up in. Um, so I want to just give kind of an example of being in a recently new space. I was thinking about how, I was in this space where I'm amongst a lot of different people that I needed to interact with, and how they perceived me was something that, like, I very consistently thought about. Um, I was in a space that was mostly male, and something I also think about a lot that maybe isn't on here is being short, being small. Sometimes when you're short and you're small, people think a certain way about you, or they feel like maybe you don't hold a lot of dominance in a conversation or in a setting because you're not taking up that space that somebody that's tall is, or you just think of like somebody towering over you, and that has a different feeling than somebody that's shorter than you, right? So, um, anyway, what I was trying to get to was that I was in this recently new space with all these new people, mostly male space, and thinking about like how they interact with me versus how they interact with each other, how they perceive me versus how they interact with each other. What they know or don't know about me is unclear. Um, so I think that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of sometimes when you know that you have these certain identities and they are intersecting, you know that you may be perceived in a certain way. And you kind of have to think about that and think about how much you want to, continue to, um, I guess, be perceived in a sort of way. It's obviously not everybody's choice on how they're perceived, but I tend to keep myself a little bit reserved when I don't know if a space is going to be safe for me, how people are going to interact with me. If I am in a space with mostly men, I don't know what that means necessarily, but sometimes, men act differently when, or I should say cis het men and white men tend to act a little bit differently than, in a group of like a queer space where I would feel a little bit more comfortable being my authentic self. So I hope that kind of helps explain things, and I believe Natasha is next.
Natasha, before we move on to you and ultimately Luann, is it okay if I share a couple things that comments that were made that are specifically in relation to the diagram that's up right now? Is that okay with you?
Yep.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, cool. Brian commented that he hits 3 on the bottom half of the diagram. He didn't go specifically into it, but he said that. And then Julia said, it is so good to see just how many aspects of intersectionality there truly are and how these factors affect our fellow community members. So I think I wanted to share them because of everything that you all are sharing this evening. I think it just shows that how complex the issue is. And I just thought it was good to share that now. And so we will move on to Natasha. I didn't mean to interrupt the flow of it, but I just wanted to share those comments with you as well.
No worries. Thank you for that. We love hearing that kind of feedback. Well, first I wanted to say, Sonia, thanks for mentioning the shortness, because I didn't even think of that in this context. And I am also short, so that adds a whole other fun level. So thanks.
To be honest, it's funny. It is funny, right? But I think about it a lot because I have to have people reach things for me all the time.
Yeah, me too. I just didn't think of it in the context of this conversation, but it makes a lot of sense. So yeah, thank you for that. But some of my other identities that I wanted to talk about is that I am biracial. So I'm half Pakistani, and that would be an out group, as well as I'm working class. What else? I'm non-religious. And then for the in group, I would say that I went to college. So I have a master's and a bachelor's and a master's. English is my first language. And then I'm going to say that 30 is young, so that I'm young. So we're just going to go with that. And then I just kind of wanted to share that being biracial in a predominantly white area has had a huge effect on my identity. It wasn't something that I embraced until I was older because I didn't want to acknowledge that I was different than people around me. So now that I've embraced it, it's one of many different identities that I have and that I love about myself. So I think it's great to look at this access, and it's not great, but it's to see, hey, what is out group and what is in group, but they're all parts of you, essentially. So we need to celebrate those. This isn't to not celebrate those. And then speaking of, I just kind of thought about this when everyone was talking, but another example would be skin color. So I am not white, I am brown, but there's different hierarchies in a lot of these categories that has been mentioned. And, when I'm with my family, when I first connected with them, I didn't think that I'm like, oh, we're just brown. But there's a hierarchy. They want to be lighter brown. And that's a whole issue. It's just interesting to think about all these different hierarchies and each different category. And so I never would have thought that I am brown, but I need to be lighter brown in this context, if that makes sense at all. So very strange, but yeah, I think Luann is next.
All righty. Thanks, Natasha. That was great. I really didn't think about my identity often. And I think part of the reason is because I held many in-group identities. White, highly educated, cisgendered, straight, citizen of the US, able-bodied. I was in a lot of those dominant areas. And however, recently, since the grayer my hair has gotten and the longer it's gotten, several of my identities have slipped into the non-dominant group. And now I'm thinking a lot about that. And I guess that, so things can shift a little bit. And I suppose I could buy more stock into dyeing my hair, but I choose not to do that. And that wouldn't do anything with the wrinkles and hard of hearing or anything like that. So I'm slipping into the oppressed or the non-in group of being older. And I have felt recently at work or in other spaces that I'm no longer relevant. I used to be, kind of commanding in the situation of, my job and things like that. And my once sought after opinions are being overlooked. At a meeting, I was basically ignored, and it's kind of a different feeling. So I'm definitely thinking more about my identity these days, considering that I'm moving from more dominant into the not so dominant. So that's been my take so far with intersectionality, and again, learning more from all of these wonderful panelists here, but I'm thinking more about it. And I guess maybe perhaps if everybody could think a little bit more about it, that would do everyone a bit more good if we all thought about some of those things, even if we're in more of the dominant types of spaces. All right, Tim, that's it for long-haired white Luann.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I definitely fall into the bottom half of getting older as well. And I used to dye my hair all the time. But now I've reached an age where I wonder if people think I would be dyeing my hair to fit in better, because, he's reached that point in getting old where he wants to be hip. And I never dyed my hair a natural color. Never once. My favorite way I dyed my hair was calico when I lived in California. I didn't think it through that you had to have that maintained every week if you were going to do that, which was short sighted on my part. But it's just interesting how everyone is talking about the shifting, the shifting sands, how it's constantly going with intersectionality. That it isn't something that's static. It's constant. It's rather fluid, from one situation to the next, from one grouping to the next. I just find that interesting. I also just enjoy being a spectator, as well as being a part of this. But it's interesting just to listen to the different and shared experiences. That's why I love doing these conversations. They're very valuable. So should I move on to the next slide, or would you like to hear some of the comments that have been made also as you've been going?
Let's hear the comments.
Okay, so one thing that I'm going to paraphrase just a little bit, but Brian, the person who said he was 3 on the bottom half, I'm just paraphrasing, not anything about your comment, Brian, but I just want to make it clear with what you were saying, and that he feels somewhat concerned that just the fact of being white, according to this chart, makes you somewhat racist. That the fact of being white makes you racist, and he finds that to be offensive. Now, what would you say about someone making that sort of commentary?
I think that someone who's looking at this chart and identifying that this chart is saying that to be white is to be racist, that's an incorrect interpretation. And the reason that that's an incorrect interpretation is because it's looking at the relationship between whiteness, right? Whether or not someone is white or a person of color, or right, whether or not someone is white or a person of color. And I think to Natasha's point, within cultures, there is a proximity to whiteness that is also preferred, right? So if you are, let's say, of a descent or of an ethnicity that is an ethnicity of color, your proximity to whiteness is given favor over your proximity to darkness, for example, right? When we look at the chart, right, we do see white in the position of dominance, and then people of color in the position of non-dominance. And then as we go across the other positions of dominance, we see like racism, sexism, genderism, heterosexism, Eurocentrism, right? So that's simply identifying that is the word that is then utilized in terms of if it were like being utilized in like the non-affirmative, right, or in the sort of like creation of harm, for example, right? So like it would be racism, for example, with in terms of the relationship between like white and non-white, or white and people of color. Like I think sometimes too, when we utilize the term racism, like we are thinking of like the negative definitions of racism, right? Where we are causing that harm towards another human, right? But if we're having a conversation about race, or if we're engaging in a conversation about, you know, kind of speaking negatively about someone else of a different ethnicity, or I'm not ethnicity, sorry, but of a different race, right? Like that could be construed as racism, regardless of who's having the conversation, right? Because it could be individuals who are all white, or it could be individuals who are all non-white, right? So like to identify that this chart is communicating that to be white is to be a racist, again, is I think an incorrect way to interpret what this chart is kind of identifying and saying.
Did anyone else want to add anything on with that before we move to some other comments?
I think it's important to add on to what Patrick said, to see this diagram as something that's for self-identification, not if you not for if you're on the white end of the spectrum that you're racist, but when you're identifying your whiteness or whether you're people of color, it's on a sliding scale. So these lines intersect in the middle, but people can have points all along these lines. And it's really for self-identification of just your identities, not to point out whether you're racist or Eurocentrist or ageist or anything. I think
self-identification.
Right, for self-identification, I visualize it as like where is my plot on each of these lines, you know, and it's not for identifying whether I'm racist, but for identifying my privilege based on that one parameter, right? So
okay.
And I guess too, if you're in the dominant category, that's where you could oppress somebody. So that you brought that up very good, that we would have to watch out for that. So certainly this is self-identification, but that's where you could have some maybe harm or some kind of domination over. So we would have to see, you know, that's where it could occur, is in the dominant, on the dominant side. So where do you fall in there? If you feel very comfortable, you know, you would put yourself not racist, but where, if you're white, that you could, you know, where would you find yourself on that continuum? So I think it's, as you said,
it's not identifying racism, it's identifying race. And I think that's where it's a little bit confusing, because it says racism, but what it means is race. So what is your race, right? And I think that, like Luann was saying, when we find ourselves in points of dominance on certain categories, it's just interesting, and we can be introspective and say, wow, like in this category, I have these privileges, and how do they affect the way that I interact with people in the world, you know, or how does it affect the way that the systems in the world interact with me? And I think that the whole purpose is introspection and just understanding you know, how complex identity really is.
I agree, and I think too, like just to kind of add to that really quickly, I think it's important to remember that when we're talking about intersectionality, right, it examines how social categories such as gender, race, ethnicity overlap and shape our experiences, or our life, or our lived experiences, or our views of the world, right? So again, it's not to identify that, you know, to be white is to be a racist. Rather, look at it from that lens of how are we examining these social categories, and how do they overlap? How do they interact, and inform the way in which we move through the world?
I'm going to bring up a series of comments that was made by one person, because it starts one place and it winds up at the destination you're describing now about how you see yourself. And some of it might get cut off because they're a bit on the longer side of the comment, but what doesn't make it onto the screen, I will read so that everyone gets it. Jennifer says, I'm glad to see my friends doing this presentation discussion about such an important topic. We all have room to grow and learn. Thank you all for the work you do in the community. Which she followed with, I have no issues accepting my queer and gender diverse identities, and I've been lucky enough to not have experienced much homophobia, but I struggle with my autistic neurodivergent identity because I feel like it's the cause of a lot of my struggles in being understood. How does one work on not being so hard on yourself? And how could someone work on accepting all their differences, treating yourself the way you treat others? And before you answer that, there is an additional comment of hers that I wanted to share, which is basically, I feel ableist towards myself, and I hate it. Thank you for sharing so much, Jennifer. I'll just open it up to everyone.
So this kind of made me think about, especially the last comment you made, Jennifer. Also, thank you for all of that. We all appreciate the comments. Especially the last comment made me think about internalized biphobia, internalized homophobia, internalized any phobia, internalized ableism, which for those who may not be familiar is basically, having those feelings that often get put on you, or those those stereotypes or negative connotations associated with certain identities, you sometimes will take in yourself and start to feel it about yourself. I identify as bisexual, so one thing that I tend to think about a lot, like I was mentioning with the ableism comment, is an internalized biphobia of not, in queer spaces, not feeling queer enough, in straight spaces, not feeling quite really straight either, because I'm not. So there's some like weirdness of like feeling totally secure in myself and kind of thinking about myself in certain ways that's not healthy, because you don't want to think about yourself in a negative light that's not going to be helpful for mental health. So I think to answer the question, somewhat of like what I really like to do, like, is surround myself or take in a lot of media, books, YouTube videos, TikTok, things like that are from those same identities that I identify with. For example, bisexual, or like Jennifer was talking about being neurodivergent. Sometimes if you surround yourself with a lot of that media or other people, you start to become a little bit more accepting in yourself because you're seeing other representation in a positive way. So making sure that you really take in a lot of positive media towards those identities, and trying to just be easy on yourself. I know that's so much easier said than done, but
I think absolutely easier said than done. And I think one thing that I remind myself of is to practice positive self-talk, and to give grace both to yourself and others, right? That I think is and healthy boundaries. I think I think those elements are probably pretty vital in controlling your narrative about you.
All right, I'm going to move on if that's okay with everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because and thank you, as Sonia said it and Patrick said, thank you for sharing with us, Jennifer. I think everyone in this group appreciates that. So thank you for being a part of the discussion. Julia commented, I think, and this is backtracking a little bit, I think that is what intersectionality highlights. There are aspects of privilege that we often aren't aware of. Conversely, there are also aspects or identities that are marginalized. Awareness of these things can help us make our community more equitable for everyone. And then Patty Hoffman, oops, I said your last name, but it was going to appear on the screen. I don't know why I normally just say first names. Patty asks, can this intersectionality diagram be made accessible? To which I would reply, just email me at the email address that you see scrolling at the banner at the bottom of the banner that's scrolling at the bottom of your screen, tkaczynski@manitowalk.org, and I can send you the entire PowerPoint presentation, which includes this diagram. So that's one way to get it. Can anyone on the panel say where it can be found quickly?
So we honestly just got this off of Google. So if you want to Google it, otherwise, you're more than welcome to message the Lakeshore's United Visionaries page or send us an email, and we're happy to send it to you.
So essentially, email anyone that's here tonight, and we'll get you it in one form or another.
The source is also listed at the very top because it comes from Catherine Morgan, describing The Emperor's New Clothes as the title of her work, 3 Myths of Educational Inequity. So that is also the source then too.
Should we move on from this diagram? That was all the comments and questions that I had at this point.
Perfect. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Okay, so obviously we don't want to take too much time with this in person, but we do want you guys to do this activity afterwards or when you have time. So it's an example of something you can try to explore your intersectionality. So use the social identity wheel to identify and reflect on the ways in which your various identities shape your experience in the world. So I think looking at this diagram and the previous one would be great to look at them together and just see what you come up with.
All right, so we've arrived at the community questions portion of the evening. I just wanted to say anyone who's interested in getting this, please contact me to get the PowerPoint, because one of the things we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on are all the resources that went into making this PowerPoint. They're all very clearly laid out at the end of it, and I just wound up bringing something up that I did not intend to. That just, I think, I am the only person who saw it, just like I was the only person who could hear the YouTube video. But I inadvertently clicked on one of the resources and it went there right away. So, but please, if you're interested in this and those 2 diagrams, which are fantastic when combined, especially, if you want any of this, please just contact me at the library, tkaczynski@manitowalk.org. I'm the marketing associate. If full name Tim Kaczynski. If you can't remember the email address, just look it up. But I'm going to broaden the picture to bring everyone a little bit bigger into the conversation so that we can actually see each other better than on a sidebar. I'm still going to stay out and just be a disembodied voice, but I will bring up the questions that we received in advance. So, but I also just wanted to state, just remember, if anyone following along has any questions or comments, please just type them into the comments box and we'll get to them. But let's start with some of the questions that we received in advance from people in the community. And this is a good one to start with. Why should we care about intersectionality? And I'm just opening it up to everyone. I'm not going to ask specifically unless something just screams to me to ask one of you specifically. But otherwise, I'll just put these up and let you guys run with them.
Well, sure. Yeah, I guess I'll maybe start off the conversation surrounding this question. I think asking the question of like, why should we care about intersectionality? I think the reality is that when we have an understanding of intersectionality, I think we have a greater depth of understanding of our neighbors, right? Of their experiences, positive or negative, right? Healthy or unhealthy, right? I think when we engage in discussion and dialogue surrounding the lived experiences of others, and I guess engage in a way that is affirming and non-judgmental, right? We create a safer community. We create a safer environment. We create a more welcoming environment, right? In my work, in my world, in my life, in my communities, I engage in understanding more in-depth elements of intersectionality to see where people are coming from, and to understand their context.
I think something that I'll add is I think this the wheel that Natasha talked about, the worksheet, but then also the one that we were on while explaining, our experiences. I think sometimes it just is helpful to sort of find out that other people have these certain identities. Like something that, maybe I don't think about very often is like different forms of um, disabilities that people have that I don't experience. So I don't know, like, or I don't always think about, like, okay, like, there's not a ramp there to get into this building for somebody that has a wheelchair, which makes it inaccessible for that person. So that's just something that, like, throughout talking about intersectionality, throughout learning about different people, different identities, different lived experiences, is something that I now, recognize that, oh, I was missing thinking about these different types of people with different needs than what I have. Um, I also think that it's important to care about intersectionality because of, for example, like media. So, when we see representation, which is great, the like Ariel is a big thing right now, that's being talked about. There's the first Black Ariel, um, and as the Little Mermaid, and that is a story that is about a character that we all know and grew up with and love, potentially, like, but it's also not a story about Black struggle. And that tends to be a common thing in media where Blackness is only associated with struggle. And while I think it's important to identify and know the history of being Black in America, it's also important to see positive and, you know, uh, normal sort of interactions with people of color or people of different identities in media where it's not just about their plight. Um, so, yeah, that's why I think another reason why it's important to know that people are not just one of their identities. They're not just one thing that's associated with their identity.
And those are all fantastic points. I think something else that you made me think of is that you also want to recognize your own different identities too. And I think that's important because some people don't always recognize all these different parts of themselves. And that is just not very helpful for yourself. And being able to know all these different parts of yourself is going to help you out in the long run.
I'm going to slide into the next question, not to get rid of the first question, but kind of, in concert with it. It's as if Natasha actually set me up to go into this question. But how does intersectionality really affect me? And that sounded like where you were going, Natasha. Really, it was like an exploration of that part of the question. So if you want to start running with it,
Always. Everyone is affected by intersectionality, always, whether they're aware of their identities or not, or how the world moves around them or how they move through the world because of their identities. Intersectionality affects everyone.
And just understanding a bit more about our neighbor, about, people's different identities. We're going to have more compassion, I think, for the general, community. If I'm in a different, if my identities are different, I still will have some compassion for everybody.
And I think.
Oh, go ahead.
You can go.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think about what Luann had to share in terms of age, for example, right? So you may be in a position where intersectionality is not necessarily something that you think about, right? Or experiencing having negative experiences in public in a community may not necessarily be part of your world. And that's okay, right? Intersectionality may not impact you, right? However, at some point it could, right? So when we think about like even accessibility or being able-bodied or advancing age, right? Those things are variable. They're not necessarily fixed. They could or will change, right? If you're able-bodied today, as you age, you may not be able-bodied in the future. And what types of amenities or what types of elements of accessibility are designed into your environment that create ease or that create a quality of life, for example.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, if we go back to what Sonia had explained from that YouTube video, if you can think about intersectionality and how it affects you, and you can, if you're being discriminated against, like for me, if I'm being discriminated against, am I just being discriminated against because I'm female, or is it also because I'm brown? So you can really dissect, not fun example really, but you can kind of see how those things intersect too. And that does affect you.
You kind of keep setting things up to go to the next question. So I'm just going to go with that. But more specifically, how does intersectionality affect our community here in Manitowoc? And again, whoever wants to start going with that.
So I can go ahead. So I think we all kind of laid out, Megan had said it affects everyone. So it's important also for our community, I think, because we have such a small, tight-knit sort of community that sometimes maybe we're not thinking fully about the different identities that people have within our community. We might have this idea of like, most of us believe this thing, or most of us are this specific thing. Like I've heard people say like, oh, this is a very Manitowoc thing. Well, not everybody is the same. Not everybody comes from the same background. Not everybody was brought up here, but we live here and we live here together. And so I think it's really important, again, understanding your neighbor, trying to make the community more accessible, more thoughtful, more inclusive for everyone. And so I think it affects our community because we can take a look at how our community has different intersectional identities and how we can make it better for everyone that's in it.
if no one has anything to add to that, I thought that was very well said. And I think almost everything the way that you're addressing the questions and just bringing up your experiences, it points out like that. Even though this is on the surface, it seems like such a simple thing, how complex it is, and it's just I keep coming back to it's such an ever shifting, very fluid situation, even internally, not just externally within the community, but for each person individually. It's very subatomic in some ways, the way it's all like interacting, and I think that's fascinating. But I'll stop, rambling.
No worries. Rambles are good, right? I think the only other thing that I would maybe add to what Sonia had kind of mentioned with respect to this question is remembering that, like, when we're looking at intersectionality, it's the intersection between in-group and out-group, right? And I think it's important for us as individual members of a community to understand those dynamics. I think it's more important for community leaders to have an understanding of the intersectionality of a community, right? Because I think any time that you're engaging in being hyper focused, let's say, on like one particular thing or one particular topic, like you lose complete sight of all other variables or all other aspects or all other perspectives, right? It is incredibly important to bring together all the things from a holistic sense, from a holistic perspective, right? Those elements that make up a whole, if you will. That's incredibly difficult and challenging to do, right? It's important work to engage in, because then you are creating the most ideal community in the best way possible that serves the needs of the community. And that is variable and diverse, right? I guess that's what I would maybe add.
So I just wanted to quickly add something else that I thought of too. I think the other thing that I kind of think about sometimes in terms of intersectionality and especially Manitowoc, the community, if anyone that's watching has spent a lot of time in a bigger city, you might realize that there tends to be a lot more diversity in bigger cities. I lived in Milwaukee for several years. And there's always been something about Milwaukee that has drawn me to it, that I've felt more at home. I felt like I could be more myself. And part of that is because there is so much more diversity and I'm seeing more people. And I'm not saying that Manitowoc, is not good because there's not diversity. There is diversity here, maybe just not as much. It is growing. And I think that it's important to recognize that it is growing, the diversity is growing. So like Patrick was saying, is really analyzing the fact that there's so many other different types of people, different identities that are within Manitowoc. And again, in like what I was talking about in comparison to somewhere like Milwaukee, the feeling of being somebody with different intersecting identities and being in one community versus being in a totally different community, you can feel totally different because of your own identity. So I guess just wanted to point that out.
All right. To head in a completely different direction with the next question. What's a common misconception regarding intersectionality?
It doesn't affect me.
Yep. That's number one, I think.
I do believe that.
Yeah.
So really, we're all human beings and we all have identities. And so intersectionality is affecting everyone. So that is important. So to identify your different identities is certainly the starting point for understanding intersectionality.
And I think that especially for people who are white and cisgender and heterosexual, especially, I think that a lot of times some of those people misunderstand intersectionality as a concept that doesn't apply to them. But I think that it's important that they all know that those are their identities, along with a myriad of other identities. It's just as important for people in majority groups, right, to understand their own intersectional identities as it is, and how that interplays as it is for people in minority groups.
I think also to add, sort of along the lines of what Megan was saying as well, is that it's intersectionality can be a little bit of a trigger term. And by that, I mean, it can make people's sort of lights flash, or like, have a sort of red flag at times. But intersectionality is not, is not calling somebody racist, is not assuming that somebody's racist or sexist or homophobic. It's simply talking about identities and how they intersect, and how that can affect different things. Not necessarily always negative, not necessarily always positive. So I think that's a huge misconception, that it's just about calling somebody racist, and it's absolutely not.
All right. Very good. I will move on to the next question. How can organizations improve on intersectionality?
I don't know that there's necessarily and that's a curious question. I don't know that there's necessarily a way for organizations to improve on intersectionality, maybe improve their understanding of intersectionality, but it's not necessarily something that is like measurable per se. I guess I'm going to say that, like, it's not necessarily measurable per se, right? I think the way to answer this question would be to identify that organizations in general can have an understanding of what the concept of intersectionality is. So then, if when oftentimes organizations tend to be very diverse, right? So having an understanding of intersectionality may be a way to have a greater understanding of their workforce, right? That, I think, is maybe the way in which organizations could improve, right? But they're really, what they're improving is their understanding of their workforce, because they have a greater understanding of how intersectionality is impacting the experience of their staff.
So I think maybe part of what this question is getting at, but maybe just not directly, is like EDI, DEI type of work, and intersectionality can be part of that. But like Patrick was saying, it's not about improving the intersectionality that's itself. Intersectionality is not something to like be improved upon, more improved upon the understanding of it. But I would say also just taking into consideration or seeking out different people with different abilities, different people with different backgrounds, and talking to them, asking questions respectfully, and trying to get a greater understanding of lived experiences for different minority groups.
So as Sonia is kind of mentioning, that one thing that comes to mind too is, like, oftentimes organizations, large or small, will have they're called BRGs, they're like business resource groups, right? So where like individuals who identify or individuals who have an identity as being a woman, for example, like they can have a business resource group where it's kind of creating that space for women to feel, you know, like they're heard and like they have like recognizing their value, for example. The same would be true for you know, another sort of like marginalized community, right? And I guess so how would intersectionality sort of like maybe be at play in that regard is by understanding the perspective that each of these individual groups are kind of like sharing perspective and thought, and then kind of identify commonality, right? Or listen to what's being asked of the organization from various individual groups to then again make improvement, right? But not improving intersectionality, rather improving again the experience of individual staff.
And to add on to that, I think that so identities are not something to be fixed or solved, but I think that if we can look at intersectionality and how some identities especially are at a disadvantage within the systems that we live in, if we want to change or improve the way that people with certain identities can move in the world and are treated, we can look at those systems, you know, and understanding intersectional identities can help us look at those systems that we move through and say, okay, well, how is this system not serving this identity? You know, how can we improve this system so that there isn't such a disparity between these two identities. So that can be helpful. And that's how another way that organizations and businesses can improve situations for different identities.
And there are many different workshops and trainings that organizations can take part in that can help with, because this will be talked about in DEI and EDI and all those different kinds of trainings. So that's another way to do it too.
Mm-hmm.
Patty, who's following along online, wondered if a better way of phrasing this question, which is sort of just a different way of it's a different question almost, but it's like, how can organizations improve on their inclusivity? You know, which would lead to probably a greater understanding, if not improving on it, but a greater understanding and acknowledgement of intersectionality. Mm-hmm. Correct? If I'm reading that right?
Well, and I think my response to that question is having a greater impact on whether or not an individual person feels included is to understand their intersectionality, right? Is to understand their individual identities and how they are perceived in the world, right? And how that individual with those intersecting identities moves through that world, right? So people feel included when they feel valued or of value or affirmed, right? And I think we every one of us as panelists can point to examples where there are certain aspects of our identity in which we felt valued, affirmed, and included, right? And there are aspects of our identities in which we felt not valued, not included, and not affirmed, right? So I think that I would agree spot on with Patty in terms of kind of reframing that question and like asking it in a different way, because in some respects we could also be talking about inclusivity, right? But I think that the understanding of intersectionality informs or better informs a conversation of inclusivity.
I just want to remind everyone that not everyone on the panel, everyone who's following along, we have one submitted questions. If you have any other questions, please, there's still time to include them. So let me get to the last submitted question, which is, how does social context affect our perceptions of race, class, and gender?
So
I'm
I
glad
think
I saved a big one for the end.
I think Patrick and I, well, and Megan a bit too, kind of touched on this. You know, it can really depend on what social situation we might be in that would, you know, make us feel more included or less included or safe or less safe. For, you know, the example that I gave earlier about being in this new space that was primarily men, and not sure how they were going to perceive me or how they were going to treat me, versus me being in a queer space. I feel most of the time I feel like I don't even have to worry about that. Like I don't feel as much like I need to be thinking about, like, you know, are people going to, you know that I identify as queer and therefore treat me differently? No, because like pretty much everybody else around me is queer, and they're, you know, generally going to be safe. So, you know, those two examples are kind of different ways in which I'm still me, I'm still the same person, but my social context changes, and therefore my thoughts change, and my perceptions, people's perceptions of me change, and my perceptions of myself and how I interact with people changes.
Yeah, I was just gonna share another example. Like for me, when I'm with my family, my Pakistani side of my family, I think and feel differently. And we, you know, I feel like if when I'm back here and I'm not surrounded by the culture or anything, it's just very different. And I think we can say, like, with all these different scenarios, like depending on your identity and your social context, all the things, people are gonna shift and move, and they're also going to act how they feel safe too. So it's just all the things.
So I have a couple of thoughts. Perception, I think, is kind of maybe the first thing that I am kind of maybe drawn to in this question. There is truth, and then there's a perception of truth, right? Those things I think are often confused, right? We view our perception of truth to be truth when it's actually not. It's just our perception of truth, because then there is then also truth, right? So that is, you know, maybe highly philosophical. But I think the reality is that when we are talking about what are our perceptions, right? Another word for perception could be judgment, right? What are our judgments? And I think that we have to be kind of careful with some of those things about the assumptions that we may or may not be making. So in terms of the question of how does social context affect our perception of race, class, and gender, or any other, you know, element of identity, I think about like reverse engineering that almost, and talking more so about like our perceptions of race, class, gender, or identities, and how do they provide context or social context, right? And I guess in that way, I kind of think of Luann's example, you know, kind of being in an environment where you're that leader, or that your opinions are being sought after, but then as you move through elements of identity, from a dominant to a less dominant role, your social context changes, right? Um, to a point where you're being perceived as less than, right, or not of value. When my opinion is that, like, we should have, like, we should be placing greater value on that experience, right, on that knowledge base, because there's just an incredible wealth of experience and knowledge that exists in that one human, and we should be extracting that, right? We should be learning from that. But oftentimes that's not what our social context tells us, right? Our social context tells us that, and Luann, I say this with love, but, you know, like old lady in the corner is not as of value right? Like that's
How
what our
dare
social
you.
context sometimes tells us. And it is horribly degrading. It's not okay. And arguably that is something that needs to change within our social context.
And I know you said that with love, Patrick. So
I
thank
do
you.
say that with love.
And you have the sunset hard hands to prove it. Well, Julia made a comment, and I don't know what exactly she was commenting on, but I completely agree with her, and it is simply well said. And you know, that is the last comment or question we have. So, I'm going to add myself back into the picture just for yucks, just to feel like I'm not so alone anymore in my office. But would anyone like to give any parting comments before we wrap this up on intersectionality in general, or this evening's experience? Just any parting shots?
I'll just say I appreciate my co-panelists, all of them. I appreciate the comments. I appreciate you, Tim, and the library for having us. And so I just want to say thank you to you all.
Ditto.
Yes.
I love doing these. I always feel a little more informed and, dare I say, intelligent leaving these panel discussions than when I entered into them. And it is a privilege working with all of you. And I always look forward to them. So thank you for setting aside the time to be a part of it, all of you. And sharing yourselves, which is not always an easy thing to do.
I just wanted to say to make sure everyone it takes time to explore their own intersectionality, especially after hearing from us.
Agreed. So I definitely always appreciate time and space to have greater discussion and greater dialogue. I think that it is important maybe I think it's maybe important to bring some voice to like some of the things that have been happening in our community, right? And to kind of like identify that we can have civil discourse, right? We are not all the same human. We have lots of variables, we have lots of contexts, we have lots of elements to our identities. And I think that that's really important when we are engaging in discussion and dialogue, particularly when we're looking at what is best for our community, right? We're not always going to agree on what is best for our community, but I think when we're having that conversation of what is best for our community, that we keep in mind one another's humanity.
Also,
Go ahead.
Also, just lastly, add if there's anything that you feel like you were curious about, or maybe you don't quite understand yet, or you had just follow-up questions, feel free to send us a DM or an email. We're happy to have further conversations.
And if you would like the PowerPoint conversation, please contact me. What word did I even say there? The PowerPoint. Let's just leave it at that. If you would like the PowerPoint, please feel free to contact me. I did want to leave with a couple of comments for the panel that just came in. Julia clarified that the whole conversation has been so well done. Thank you all. And Patty also said, great panel discussion. I learned so much. I completely agree with Patty and with Julia. I love these conversations because they are conversations and they're community conversations. And the more we have of things like this, the better our community is going to be. And just across the board, I think it's interesting that Patrick, you set up our next panel discussion, which is civil discourse and civility. And we're having it, of course, during the heart of the holiday season. So
Tis the season, Tim.
tis the season for a good conversation. I'm going to sign off because we don't have anything else, any questions coming in. But I did want to leave a parting shot of my own, and I'm actually going to be paraphrasing Natasha. She said it in her article that she wrote for Sea Haver News about this, and she also said it when she was on the radio. And it applies to, you know, just how simple and complex and fluid the topic of intersectionality is, and how it applies to everyone. And it was just a great, simple, easy to grasp onto sentence, which is no one is just one thing. And I think that's kind of like the key to, you know, it is just such a great entry into thinking about intersectionality, because if you just start thinking about that, it applies to yourself and branches out, and it really never stops. So although I might be paraphrasing a little bit, Natasha, thank you so much for including that in your article, because I found that to be super profound in its simplicity, elegant in its simplicity. So, but Sonia, Luann, Patrick, Natasha, and Megan, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation tonight. Thank you, Love, for partnering with the library on this. Like I said as earlier, I consider it a privilege to be a part of it, even though I'm just the disembodied voice in the background for most of it. I love being a part of it. So thank you all. Have a great evening, and join us on December 1st for the next conversation about civil discourse, because as Patrick said, 'tis the season. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Bye-bye.